The lamps of London cast long, trembling shadows tonight, and somewhere in the quiet streets, a secret stirs that has lain hidden for generations. Imagine the chill of a November evening, the faint scent of smoke and rain drifting through narrow alleys, and the uneasy stillness that makes every step feel consequential. Tonight, we are drawn into the world of a family estate, ancient and proud, where whispers of obsession, treasure, and hidden maps tug at the edges of both reason and conscience. Before the tale unfolds, I wonder, where are you listening from this evening, and what hour has greeted you in your corner of the world? Share it in the comments. Let us know where this story finds you. The wind presses against the windows, and in the quiet of the estate, a single candle trembles. Come closer and follow the footsteps that will lead us into intrigue, deception, and a mystery that tests the very limits of human desire. The evening is deep, the shadows are long, and now the story begins. It was upon the conclusion of a lengthened promenade through the fog-bound streets of London that Holmes and I returned to the familiar sanctuary of 221B Baker Street. The evening air lay heavy with mist, damp and penetrating, curling around the gas lamps and diffusing their pallid light in a manner that lent the thoroughfares an almost spectral character. Holmes, whose eyes are perpetually attuned to the slightest irregularity, walked with his habitual precision, observing the minutest deviations in pavement wear, the subtle arrangements of window displays, and the manner in which passers-by adjusted their coats against the chill. I, ever the faithful chronicler, took note of the sharp contrast between his alertness and my own leisurely attentions, perceiving with renewed admiration the faculties which rendered him, in my estimation, singularly endowed among men. There was, indeed, a tension in his carriage, a quiet energy that bespoke anticipation rather than fatigue. The fog seemed to cling more insistently to the corners of Baker Street as we neared our door, and yet it was not the London damp that commanded my attention, but the discernment with which Holmes surveyed each subtle sign of human presence, in the habitual silence that accompanies our return from such excursions. He inclined his head slightly toward a narrow alley and murmured, "Observe, Watson, how the dust lies upon the flagstones. A careful eye may divine more than a casual glance." It was then, under the shrouded glow of the lamp-posts, that I became conscious of the ever-pervasive air of expectancy which always precedes the awakening of one of his extraordinary cases, a forewarning that the night held matters most peculiar. No sooner had we entered our familiar sitting-room than Holmes's attention was drawn to a small item in the evening papers that lay scattered upon the table. It was a notice of an altogether singular character, a missing medieval artifact described in terse yet precise terms, known as the Bloodstone Map of Canterbury. Holmes's brow contracted in the faintest of frowns, and he read aloud, not for my benefit alone, but as though voicing a challenge to the very facts themselves. I observed the manner in which his keen eyes flicked from word to word, capturing nuance, inflection, and the peculiarities of phrasing that might escape a less discerning mind. "Remarkable," he murmured, "that so small a paragraph should conceal such depth of implication." He speculated upon the circumstances of its disappearance, questioning the custodial arrangements of the artifact, the intentions of those entrusted with its safekeeping, and the possible allure it might present to a malefactor. I, in my usual fashion, recorded his every intonation, impressed anew by the facility with which he transformed a few printed lines into a fertile field for deductive inquiry. Already, the faintest shadow of intrigue had been cast upon the room, and I realized that, in a matter so seemingly trivial, the wheels of an extraordinary investigation were silently but inexorably in motion. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and allowed his gaze to wander, as if consulting some inner ledger of facts not apparent to ordinary perception. "Consider, Watson," he began, in measured tones, "the historical value of such an artifact, and the motive it might offer. Were this theft purely mercenary, The thief would scarcely endure the complications of familial legacy, and yet, if it be that personal pride or vindication compels him, the calculation is altogether different. He proceeded to enumerate possibilities with the rapidity and precision that never failed to astonish me. The predilections of collectors, the schemes of rival heirs, and the greed of those for whom antiquity offers only the lustre of wealth. All the while, his eyes remained sharp and intent, detecting the weight of inference in the simplest phrasing of the newspaper item. "Observe, Watson," he continued, "how a singular phrase, historical guide, may indicate not mere treasure, but a pathway to a collection long hidden from the eyes of the world. The implications are manifold." As he spoke, I felt the thrill of intellectual engagement, sensing how a mind such as his could extract the entire architecture of human ambition and folly from a mere paragraph, so that one might almost discern, in the quietude of our sitting room, the future twists and turns of events yet to unfold. Even as Holmes discoursed upon the possible motives and circumstances surrounding the Bloodstone map, I was struck by the peculiar atmosphere that had settled upon our rooms. There was a subtle tension in the air, a sense that the ordinary calm of Baker Street had been infiltrated by secrets not yet confessed. The shadows along the walls appeared unusually deep, the ticking of the clock spoke with a curious insistence, and even the low murmur of distant carriage wheels seemed fraught with import. One could not ignore the sensation of eyes unseen, of events half concealed, as though the city itself held its breath in anticipation. I could not help but feel that we were poised upon the very threshold of something extraordinary. The faint rustle of papers, the smell of smoke from the lamps, and the stillness of the fire combined to form a tableau that was as expectant as it was forbidding. In such an ambiance, I was ever conscious of Holmes's serenity, which stood in marked contrast to the underlying unease that prickled my senses. It was while I rose to draw the curtains that I first noticed a figure, half concealed by the London fog, moving with deliberate discretion along the street below. My heart quickened at the subtle menace implied by its passage, and I observed Holmes's calm scrutiny as he too marked the shadow. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is your first tangible signal of a presence more than mere coincidence. Note the gait, the hesitation at corners, the deliberate avoidance of illumination." I bent closer to the window, tracing the silhouette as it flickered in and out of view, and I perceived, as Holmes had, the faint air of purpose in its movement, the calculated concealment of identity, and the precise awareness of our domicile. Though no action yet threatened us, the encounter suffused the evening with a tangible tension. Holmes's mind, as I understood, was already at work, connecting this shadow with the possible motives of those who would seek the Bloodstone map. I felt, as I have so often felt in his company, that we were standing upon the cusp of a mystery both intricate and perilous, one that would draw us swiftly into the concealed intrigues of men whose aims were as elusive as the fog itself. The stillness of 221B Baker Street had scarcely settled about us when a sudden knock, sharp and urgent, reverberated through the room. The chill of the evening had crept beneath the door frames, bringing with it a dampness that clung to our coats and lent the lamp-lit sitting room a curious intimacy. I rose with a measure of trepidation, sensing, as I have so often done in the presence of Holmes's perceptive anticipation, that the interruption was no ordinary visitor. The knock was repeated, more insistent this time, and the sound seemed amplified by the muted quiet that enveloped the street outside. Holmes did not move, but his keen eyes, gleaming with a characteristic intensity, observed my approach, silently urging calm. When the door opened, there stood a lady of refined bearing, her garments slightly dishevelled, and her face pale, as though the chill or some inner agitation had sapped her usual composure. She introduced herself with the hesitant dignity of one accustomed to decorum, yet driven by pressing need. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, her voice trembling but determined. "I am Lady Beatrice Marlowe. Pray forgive my intrusion at so late an hour, but I know of none whose counsel is so wise, so discerning as yours." There was an immediate and palpable tension, an anticipatory anxiety in the air, as though the very night had conspired to bring her to our door at precisely the moment her troubles demanded a solution. Holmes inclined his head slightly, motioning her to enter, and the case, invisible until now, began to take the faintest outline in my mind. Once seated, Lady Beatrice allowed herself a moment to gather composure, and then spoke of her family's possession of a singularly precious artifact, the Bloodstone Map of Canterbury. She described its antiquity with reverent precision, recalling the venerable halls in which it had been safeguarded for generations, and the hidden treasures that it purportedly revealed. Her voice wavered, but there was an unmistakable authority in her narrative, born of intimate knowledge and personal concern. She spoke of the map not merely as a collection of lines upon vellum, but as a key to historical insight, a tangible bridge between centuries past and the present. Holmes listened with that penetrating attention which I have come to recognize as preternatural, eyes never leaving her countenance, noting every inflection, every pause, and every subtle gesture. The lady's concern was more than academic. It was steeped in familial pride, in a heritage that she clearly felt compelled to protect at any cost. As she continued, she conveyed, almost inadvertently, the subtle anxieties which accompany the guardianship of something both valuable and irreplaceable, the obligations, the secrecy, the ever-present awareness that some men covet what they cannot possess. In the stillness of our sitting room, punctuated only by the occasional whisper of gas from the lamp, I could perceive Holmes's mind at work, cataloguing, classifying, and connecting the layers of emotion, history, and human desire that were entwined with the map. It became immediately evident that the case, though seemingly a matter of lost property, contained depths far more intricate and fraught than any ordinary theft. Lady Beatrice hesitated, casting a glance over her shoulder, as though fearful that the very walls might bear witness to her disclosures. She produced with trembling hands several letters, typewritten and unsigned, which contained cryptic threats against her family, should the map remain in their possession. Each missive was meticulously phrased, betraying not mere anger or greed, but the intent of a mind both calculating and patient. She related, with an evident shudder, the mysterious disappearance of a trusted servant, one who had attended the estate for many years and whose absence now exacerbated the sense of imminent peril. "He vanished without warning," she murmured, "and I cannot help but fear that he fell victim to those who would seize the map by any means." Holmes, reclining with an air of contemplative attention, observed each envelope, noting the peculiarities of handwriting, paper, and ink, while also registering Lady Beatrice's emotional strain. I, for my part, was acutely aware of the heightened danger, of the personal stakes involved, and of the sense of encroaching menace that now enveloped the narrative. Every word she spoke seemed to draw us further into a web of intrigue, where the motives of avarice, obsession, and legacy intersected with the fragile threads of human loyalty. The night, already dense with fog, now seemed imbued with an additional chill, as though the very city sensed the unfolding threat. Holmes's mind, I could see, had begun to map the interplay of personalities, circumstances, and hazards, preparing to unravel what appeared, in the lady's fear, both complex and deeply personal. Holmes, having listened intently to her tale, now inclined slightly forward, hands steepled, and posed a series of deliberate inquiries. His questions, seemingly casual, revealed his methodical approach. "Pray, Lady Beatrice, was the map ever entrusted to more than a single household member? Has any outsider been permitted its examination in recent months? And of your missing servant, did he confide in anyone, even in passing, regarding peculiarities at the estate?" Each query, precise and measured, sought not merely information, but subtleties, the hesitation of a pause, the shift of a hand, the inflection that betrayed concern or concealment. Lady Beatrice answered, candid, yet constrained, and in her responses Holmes detected the nuanced tensions between honesty, fear, and familial obligation. I watched him as he interlaced observation with deduction, silently cataloguing every fact, every emotional cue, and every incongruity. He proceeded to outline in quiet tones possible scenarios, weighing motives and opportunities, considering both internal and external threats. It was a demonstration, as always, of his unparalleled acumen, the construction of a mental framework that would allow him to navigate with precision the labyrinth of human behavior and circumstance. I could scarcely keep pace with the rapidity and subtlety of his reasoning, though I endeavored to commit every detail to memory, knowing that each might prove vital in the unfolding investigation. As Holmes pursued his line of questioning, I turned my attention once more to Lady Beatrice. Her fear was apparent, a delicate tremor in her voice, the subtle quiver of her hands, and the occasional faltering in her gaze. I noted the strain in her posture, the manner in which she clutched the letters, as though they were talismans against the encroaching danger. In these moments, the gravity of the situation became fully manifest. This was no mere theft, no trivial misplacement of property, but a matter of personal jeopardy, historical import, and ethical responsibility. Every interaction, every sigh, every measured glance between her and Holmes underscored the stakes at hand, drawing me, as chronicler and observer, into the emotional currents that underpinned the case. I felt the pressing weight of the lady's concern and the subtle ways in which the threat had infiltrated the ordinary rhythms of life, leaving in its wake a fragile tapestry of apprehension, duty, and dread. In this, I found both sympathy and an understanding of the profound role which human sentiment would play in the mystery before us. Holmes, after a moment of reflective pause, allowed his gaze to wander toward the fireplace, as though considering matters beyond immediate peril. "It is ever the tension between greed and heritage, Watson," he observed quietly, "that animates such intrigues. One may covet, yet must weigh the consequences upon those entrusted with preservation." I nodded in concurrence, sensing that the moral dimension, intertwined with the historical and emotional stakes, would guide both the pursuit and the judgment to follow. The evening, already thick with anticipation, now carried a subtle ethical resonance, hinting that our path would navigate not only facts and clues, but the very impulses that define human character. We departed London at an hour when the city still clung to the vestiges of evening activity, the streets dampened by a faint drizzle that lent the gaslights a blurred, melancholic glow. Holmes was unusually silent at first, his gaze intermittently tracing the patterns of the passing landscape from our carriage window. Rolling hills, patchwork fields, and the occasional clump of woodland unfolded before us, their serenity belying the tension which had occupied our minds since Lady Beatrice's urgent visit. I remarked upon the antiquity of the estates dotted along the route, particularly those that bore the hallmarks of Tudor and Elizabethan architecture, and Holmes responded with a quiet enumeration of historical events, associating each locality with the intrigues of families long vanished from prominence. "I find it remarkable, Watson," he said finally, "how a single artifact, such as the Bloodstone Map, may intertwine with centuries of heritage and human ambition, carrying with it the consequences of avarice and loyalty alike." I listened, noting the mixture of intellectual fascination and emotional restraint in his voice. Our conversation drifted from the topography to the Marlowe estate itself, a sprawling property reputed for its lineage, its carefully preserved archives, and, of course, the very map which now imperiled the family. The journey, though seemingly a matter of mere miles, felt like a passage into history itself, each turn of the carriage wheels bringing us nearer to a house steeped in legacy, secrecy, and the shadow of an unresolved threat. Holmes's mind, I sensed, was already traversing corridors of deduction far in advance of our physical progress, anticipating the challenges that awaited at our destination. As our carriage approached the Marlowe estate, the grand facade of the house emerged from a copse of venerable oaks, their limbs knotted and leaf-laden, swaying gently in the breeze. The building, a mixture of stone and timber, spoke of centuries of careful stewardship, yet subtle signs betrayed tension. shutters slightly askew, windows unpolished, and the faint scent of lavender mingled with an undercurrent of unease. The staff greeted us with the polite reserve of those accustomed to visitors, yet there was a tremor in their attentiveness, a nervousness that spoke volumes to Holmes's keen eye. Lady Beatrice, who had arrived ahead of us to oversee our reception, appeared briefly at a distant terrace, her posture upright but anxious, suggesting both the dignity and strain of her position. Holmes observed the household's demeanour silently, noting the fleeting exchange of glances and the restrained gestures that betrayed concern. I, in turn, could not help but notice the aura of expectancy that clung to the estate, as though every hallway and corridor had absorbed the weight of recent events. We were ushered into a sitting room richly adorned with tapestries and the quiet dignity of inherited wealth. Yet I sensed, and Holmes confirmed with a subtle nod, that beneath this veneer of elegance, anxieties ran deep, and the coming days would test both the intellect and the moral fortitude of all involved. Holmes led me through the vast corridors of the Marlowe estate to a library that could only be described as the repository of generations. The air within was heavy with the scent of aged parchment, leather bindings, and a faint trace of dust undisturbed by ordinary domesticity. Rows upon rows of tomes, many centuries old, lined the walls, their spines embossed with gold leaf and family crests. Holmes's eyes immediately scanned the titles with a rapidity that suggested both familiarity and an instinctive anticipation of significance. He paused before a shelf of medieval chronicles and illuminated manuscripts. With gentle fingers, he turned the pages, noting, as I had often observed, the almost imperceptible marginalia left by previous readers, tiny annotations, cryptic symbols, and the occasional flourish of ink that spoke of both erudition and secrecy. One particular volume, A History of Canterbury's Ecclesiastical Treasures, contained a series of markings in an unfamiliar cipher. Holmes examined them with unwavering attention, his brow furrowed only slightly, and murmured, "Here, Watson, the hand is deliberate, and the cipher suggests a practical, if concealed, intention, guiding the reader towards something hidden, yet known only to the initiator." A second discovery was a small, leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and brittle. Its entries, though written in a conventional hand, employed a combination of shorthand and symbolic notation. Holmes deciphered several passages almost instinctively, cross-referencing with the marginalia in the tomes. "It appears," he observed quietly, "that the map's whereabouts are alluded to obliquely, as if to protect it from casual curiosity, yet accessible to one trained in the family's methods of concealment." As Holmes worked, I noted his meticulous observation of physical details beyond the textual, the pattern of dust upon a lectern suggesting recent disturbance, a faint indentation upon the carpet hinting at the movement of heavy furniture, and an unusual wear upon a windowsill, as though it had been used repeatedly as a vantage point. Each clue, while seemingly minor to the untrained eye, accumulated in Holmes's mind to form a lattice of deduction that would, he assuredly indicated, converge upon the truth. The thrill of discovery and the mounting sense of danger infused the library with an almost tangible electricity, and I realized that we had entered not merely a house of history, but the threshold of an unfolding enigma that would demand every measure of our intellect and moral vigilance. From a discreet vantage point behind the yew hedges bordering the Marlowe estate, Holmes and I spent the better part of the afternoon observing the neighbouring properties. The sun, slanting low, cast long shadows across the meticulously tended gardens, yet there was little serenity in their quietude. Holmes's gaze moved with the precision of a hawk, noting the slightest irregularities, the hurried movements of a groundsman who paused briefly to glance toward our position, the lingering presence of a coachman who seemed overly interested in our carriage, and the subtle signalling of a woman at a distant window, her glance darting with barely concealed apprehension. "These are not casual glances, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low but steady. "Each movement, though superficially benign, betrays a consciousness of observation. There is an intelligence behind these actions, and it is curious to note the differences in purpose between the parties. Indeed, our surveillance revealed several figures whose behavior suggested deliberate reconnaissance rather than the mere idleness of estate life. One man, tall and angular, appeared repeatedly in the peripheral windows of the neighbouring manor, always retreating when his presence was noted. Another figure, a younger individual with a nervous gait, lingered near a boundary wall, measuring distances with a subtle rod or cane. Holmes's analytical eye catalogued each motion, linking them in his mind to possible motives and patterns of intrusion. I, despite my desire to remain detached, felt the first prickle of unease, recognizing that the search for the Bloodstone map had attracted more than mere curiosity. It had drawn the attention of rival seekers, each capable of acts both cunning and unscrupulous. The estate, in its stately repose, seemed to pulse with hidden life, the very air heavy with anticipation and quiet menace, and I realized that our investigation was entering a phase where observation would be as vital as deduction itself. Our next discovery arrived in a manner both subtle and disquieting. Among the papers in the library, carefully tucked within the folds of an ancient folio, Holmes extracted a map remarkably similar in form and detail to the fabled Bloodstone map. Its ink was crisp, its paper faintly aged, yet there was an almost imperceptible irregularity in the shading and in the precise placement of landmarks. Holmes held the document up, scrutinizing it with a delicate tilt. "Observe, Watson," he remarked. "The lines converge here at a location which, according to the authentic map, bears no such annotation. The details are superficially convincing, but the hand behind this work is that of a forger, attempting to mislead rather than to illuminate." I traced the map with my finger, noting that while it suggested plausible routes and hiding places, it contained subtle errors: a church spire misaligned, a garden gate absent, and a stream diverted from its true course. Holmes's eyes gleamed with restrained triumph as he explained, in that quiet, exacting tone I had come to recognize, that the map had been planted deliberately to misdirect those pursuing the treasure. "This, my dear Watson, is a classic instance of psychological misdirection," he said. "The criminal relies upon our curiosity and eagerness to pursue, yet every false step informs us more than mere progress ever could. One must always question the appearance of certainty, for therein lies the danger, and simultaneously, the opportunity." In my heart, I sensed both relief and renewed vigilance. The forged map, while deceptive, had illuminated the intentions of an adversary who understood both the value of the treasure and the methods by which their pursuit might be confounded. Our task, it seemed, required heightened scrutiny and an unerring attention to detail. Holmes's attention then turned to the minutiae of the estate itself, where he began to discern the subtle footprints of an intruder. In the conservatory, he pointed out a slight disturbance of dust along the threshold, barely perceptible to the casual observer, which indicated the passage of a figure of moderate weight. On the drawing-room carpet, he noted a pattern of wear inconsistent with ordinary use, suggesting repeated traversal along a precise path. "The devil is in the details, Watson," he observed quietly. "Every action leaves a mark, however transient, and it is the accumulation of these minutiae that reveals the truth." We proceeded to the garden, where Holmes's trained eye immediately picked out a footprint partially concealed among the gravel. Its depth and alignment suggested a hurried movement, yet it bore the unmistakable imprint of someone accustomed to the terrain. He compared it with other traces, and, with a series of subtle gestures, demonstrated how the intruder had circumnavigated certain areas, deliberately avoiding contact with those likely to observe. Even the furniture spoke volumes. A faint indentation upon the arm of a chair, a misaligned bookcase, and a windowsill smoothed by repeated use all contributed to a mental map of recent activity. Holmes noted, as I scribbled hurriedly in my notebook, that these seemingly trivial details collectively revealed the intruder's methods, timing, and ultimately, character. It was in this careful attention to the physical world that Holmes's genius shone brightest. Each imperfection, each trace of human presence, formed part of a larger narrative invisible to the untrained eye. I felt a mixture of awe and apprehension, recognizing that these subtle clues were leading us ever closer to understanding not merely the act of theft, but the mind behind it, a mind both cunning and dangerously precise. As Holmes continued his meticulous scrutiny, I found myself reflecting upon both his methods and the mounting tension that seemed to saturate the estate. Each movement he noted, each anomaly he catalogued, heightened the sense that we were being observed in turn, that the antagonist's presence was a shadow upon our every step. My own apprehension grew, tempered by the conviction that we were under the guidance of a mind capable of deciphering even the most cunning of deceptions. I noted the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the flicker of curtains in distant windows, and the faint rustling that suggested a presence beyond the immediate line of sight. The estate, in its venerable grandeur, had become a theatre of psychological tension. Every sound and gesture carried significance. Holmes moved with quiet assurance, yet I could not help but sense his awareness of dangers that lay beyond the visible. At moments, the thrill of deduction was accompanied by an uneasy recognition of vulnerability. Lady Beatrice's anxiety, the servants' furtive glances, and the unpredictable movements of our rivals coalesced into a palpable tension which seemed to cling to the very walls. I endeavoured to document Holmes's process as he observed, questioned, and inferred, for in doing so I captured not merely the progress of the investigation, but the emotional undercurrent that animated it. The more we discerned, the more it became apparent that the search for the Bloodstone map had drawn us into a web of human ambition and obsession, one in which the boundaries between cunning and malice were perilously thin. The estate no longer appeared as a mere residence. It was a crucible in which intellect, morality, and risk would collide. As I watched Holmes's keen eyes scan each corner, each object, each movement, I realized that the true mystery was not merely the treasure itself, but the intricate patterns of human desire it had so inevitably unleashed. The Marlowe estate, despite its venerable grandeur, soon became the recipient of communications most disquieting in nature. One morning, as the household moved with its accustomed decorum, a footman brought letters bearing no signature, only a series of elaborate flourishes in the corner of the envelope. Lady Beatrice herself received the first missive, and her pallor was such that even Holmes, ever composed, regarded her with a slight concern. I observed Holmes's meticulous attention as he examined the correspondence. The paper was of an inferior yet carefully selected quality, the ink a deep indigo that suggested either deliberate concealment or familiarity with the methods of clandestine writing. He turned each sheet over, noting the minute tremors in the strokes of the pen, the subtle pressure variations, and the peculiar use of certain archaic words. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "The choice of diction is deliberate. Our correspondent is a person of intelligence, though one who revels in theatrics. There is both pride and caution, the temperament of a mind accustomed to planning and concealment." Lady Beatrice, trembling, read aloud phrases veiled in threat, invoking consequences should the Bloodstone map be removed or divulged. Holmes's eyes, unblinking and discerning, caught the smallest deviations in syntax, the faintly inconsistent spacing between lines, all of which suggested a scrupulous hand concealing impatience beneath calculated calm. He remarked on what the letters did not say as much as what they did, and I, ever awed by his method, noted the rapid deduction in my journal. Even as the missives instilled unease, they offered a glimpse into the mind that had set these events in motion. The Marlowe family's treasures, it seemed, were entwined not merely with history, but with a human temperament both exacting and dangerous. The letters served as both warning and invitation, compelling us to anticipate the actions that might follow, a prelude to the shadows gathering around the estate. In the evenings that followed, the estate's serenity gave way to a restless vigilance. From the drawing-room window, I frequently glimpsed figures moving under the dim cloak of darkness, their forms partially concealed by hedgerows and the mist that lingered low over the lawns. Holmes required no prompting to observe these intrusions. His gaze, unwavering and precise, traced the movements with a care that rendered even the smallest gesture significant. One night, I noticed a tall figure pause near the boundary wall, its head inclined as if listening, while another crouched momentarily behind a cluster of shrubs. Holmes murmured observations about gait and timing, noting the deliberate avoidance of lighted areas and the caution with which the intruders traversed known paths. "They know the estate well enough to avoid exposure, Watson," he whispered. "This is no mere opportunist. The subtlety indicates planning and an understanding of human attention." The household, already tense from the letters, grew increasingly unsettled. Footsteps, once dismissed as the wind among the trees, were now considered with apprehension. Distant murmurs and the clatter of branches were interpreted as evidence of intruders probing the estate. Lady Beatrice's anxiety was palpable, and the servants moved with a nervous haste, aware that their every motion could be scrutinized. Even from within the safety of the drawing-room, one could sense the malevolent presence stalking the grounds. It was as if the estate itself had become a stage upon which unseen actors enacted a drama of threat and suspense, and Holmes, ever the observer, catalogued these nightly apparitions with a mixture of analytical detachment and barely concealed concern. The shadows, I realized, were more than mere darkness. They were the harbingers of danger that was yet to fully reveal itself. Our vigilance proved prescient. On a night steeped in wind and fog, a noise, soft, deliberate, yet unmistakable, alerted Holmes to the approach of an intruder. I awoke to find him moving with extraordinary swiftness, his figure a model of controlled urgency. We descended to the hall and discovered the French windows leading to the gardens disturbed. The lock had been tampered with, yet, by providence or design, the perpetrator had been thwarted before entry. Holmes examined the points of attempted ingress with meticulous care, the scratches upon the lock, the minute displacement of splinters along the frame, and the faint, half-erased scuff upon the floor, all yielded insight into the intruder's method. He inferred, with his usual precision, the probable height, reach, and even the habitual movements of the would-be thief. "See here, Watson," he said softly, "a practitioner of patience, yet one impelled by desperation or obsession. Note the care, the repeated trials at the lock, and the measured pressure. These are hallmarks of a mind both intelligent and singularly fixated." The household, roused by our examination, remained on edge, each creaking floorboard or distant whistle of the wind taken as a potential sign of renewed intrusion. Lady Beatrice's hands trembled as she recounted the location of the family's treasures, yet Holmes, ever composed, gently reassured her that the observations would yield knowledge of the adversary's habits, limitations, and temperament. I felt a shiver of foreboding as we catalogued these traces, aware that the act was not random, but purposeful, tied inexorably to the obsessions that had propelled the mysterious letters and the shadows in the night. The break-in, though foiled, confirmed the presence of an antagonist whose reach was both precise and intimate. In that hour, I sensed that the forthcoming trials would demand both vigilance and cunning far beyond ordinary caution. As the night waned and the estate settled once more into uneasy quiet, Holmes reflected upon the nature of the threat with a measured gravity. The letters, the shadows, and the break-in suggested more than mere greed. He suspected motives entwined with family history, a fixation rooted in pride, and the desire to restore perceived ancestral honor. "The intruder," he observed in his precise tone, "is not merely after the treasure in a mercenary sense. The actions betray an obsession, a personal narrative superimposed upon the pursuit of wealth. Each move is calculated yet emotionally charged, reflecting a psychological investment that extends beyond material gain." I listened, fascinated by the insight. Holmes's eyes, luminous with deductive fire, traced patterns invisible to ordinary observation. He spoke of lineage, inheritance disputes, and the vulnerabilities inherent in long-standing familial estates. The treasure, in this light, became both a symbol and a catalyst, inciting the intruder to acts guided by both passion and intellect. I sensed, as Holmes continued, that the Marlowe family's historical legacy had become entangled with human obsession, and that we were observing a mind wherein devotion to ancestral pride had morphed into a dangerous, consuming preoccupation. Holmes's suspicion soon found corroboration through the discovery of intercepted correspondence. Among the papers retrieved from a discreetly hidden compartment in the estate's servants' quarters, he located a series of notes and letters addressed to the household, yet never delivered. Their language mirrored that of the original threatening letters, though with subtle variations betraying impatience and obsession. Holmes examined the sequence, noting the recurrence of particular phrases, the meticulous yet slightly erratic penmanship, and the rhythm of sentences indicating a mind both methodical and anxious. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The obsessive repetition, the precise phrasing, and the meticulous concealment. We are dealing with an antagonist who thrives upon control, precision, and the psychological manipulation of those who guard the treasure." The letters revealed patterns. The intruder had a keen understanding of human behavior, anticipated reactions, and subtly adjusted methods in response to the household's movements. Each intercepted note served as both a warning and a calculated probe, confirming the cleverness and daring inherent in the adversary's designs. Holmes's gaze swept the papers with a quiet intensity. It was evident that the intruder's obsession had grown, and that each communication contributed to a larger, carefully orchestrated strategy, a strategy that we were only beginning to understand. From these observations and intercepted writings, Holmes constructed a psychological sketch of the intruder. He noted tendencies toward delusion, obsessive repetition, and a meticulous attention to detail that bordered on compulsive. The adversary's fixation on the Bloodstone Map was not mere greed, but a consuming preoccupation intertwined with notions of honor, legacy, and personal vindication. Holmes's analysis extended to behavioral traits: patience bordering on ritual, careful observation of others' reactions, and the ability to anticipate countermeasures with frightening accuracy. The letters, break-in, and shadows in the night collectively indicated a mind capable of both cunning stratagem and sudden, unpredictable action. "Such a character," Holmes remarked, "is dangerous not merely for the treasure they seek, but for the extremities to which they may go when frustrated. We must anticipate both the intellect and the obsession in equal measure." The household, I observed, existed in a state of perpetual tension. Servants whispered nervously, eyes darting to corners and shadows. Lady Beatrice's steps faltered in the corridors, and the servants' anxieties multiplied her own. Every creaking floorboard, distant cough, or shifting curtain became imbued with ominous potential. Holmes, ever composed, recognized and catalogued these responses, yet I could not help but note the profound emotional toll the circumstances had wrought. The estate, once a place of proud lineage, now throbbed with apprehension, each moment pregnant with the possibility of confrontation, a prelude to the crisis that we could all sense was approaching. The Marlowe estate, already under the pall of unease from prior warnings and intrusions, suffered a calamity that night which seemed to plunge the household into a state of immediate peril. I was roused from a restless slumber by the hurried footsteps of servants and a muffled exclamation that reached my ears from the upper corridors. Lady Beatrice's voice, taut with alarm, carried the dreadful news. The estate had been broken into once more, and the very object which had drawn us into this web of mystery, the genuine Bloodstone Map, was missing. Holmes, ever composed in the face of sudden crisis, moved with deliberate swiftness. Yet beneath his calm exterior, I could detect a sharpened intensity, a readiness to analyze, observe, and record every minute detail. He surveyed the room where the treasure had been secured, noting the displacement of small objects, the slight abrasions upon the lock, and the faint impressions upon the carpet that suggested rapid yet cautious movement. "The thief is bold, but not reckless," he remarked quietly, almost to himself. "Observe the precision, Watson. There is method in this audacity." The household reacted with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Lady Beatrice, her hands trembling upon the banister, tried in vain to comprehend the speed and skill with which the intruder had accomplished the task. I too felt a rising apprehension, knowing that the threat was no longer abstract but immediate, tangible, and dangerously intimate. The estate, once a sanctuary of family legacy, had become a stage for audacious criminal enterprise, and in that instant, the stakes had risen far beyond mere curiosity or historical intrigue. The sense of dread was compounded shortly thereafter when a commotion arose near the servants' quarters. A trusted member of the household staff, who had served the Marlowe family for decades, was discovered lying in a state of unconsciousness upon the floor. The sight struck a chord of horror through us all, for it was no longer only the treasure that had been imperiled. The safety of those dear to the estate was at immediate risk. I knelt beside the servant, taking note of the pallor and irregular breathing, while Holmes methodically examined the surroundings for clues. A small scuff upon the floorboards, the faint impression of a boot upon the carpet, and the subtle smear of ink on a nearby note. Lady Beatrice, overcome with distress, clutched at my arm, her eyes wide with anxiety, beseeching that we uncover the cause and apprehend the culprit before further harm could befall any member of her household. Holmes, though deeply concerned, maintained his characteristic composure. He directed servants to summon assistance quietly and efficiently, his mind already racing to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to this violent intrusion. "The attack upon the servant is deliberate," he noted in a low tone. "It demonstrates not only the perpetrator's familiarity with the estate, but also an unsettling readiness to inflict personal harm if necessary." I recorded every detail with care, acutely aware that the physical evidence intertwined with the emotional consequences, revealing a threat both methodical and merciless. The theft was no longer a simple matter of pilfered property. It had escalated into an assault upon trust, security, and human dignity. In the immediate aftermath, Holmes conducted a meticulous examination of the estate, moving with the precision of a man whose mind was finely attuned to the language of detail. He scrutinized each entry point, the windows, doors, and lesser-used passages, with a measured eye, noting scratches, displaced furniture, and other subtle signs that would elude the untrained observer. Each footprint, each disturbance in dust or carpet nap, seemed to him a sentence in the story of the intruder's passage. Holmes's observations extended beyond mere physical traces. He noted the patterns of movement among the household staff, the locations they frequented most, and the routines that governed the estate. "The criminal," he remarked quietly, "possesses intimate knowledge of both the architecture and the daily practices within this house. There is a familiarity that cannot be acquired in haste. This is someone who has observed or inhabited these spaces with care and intent." He traced potential lines of approach and retreat, deducing the intruder's likely considerations in selecting pathways and points of entry. Every doorknob, every shadowed corridor, was a clue to the mind behind the crime. I could only marvel at his capacity to perceive patterns so subtle, to weigh the significance of minor disturbances with a precision that suggested an almost preternatural grasp of human behavior. By the end of our survey, it was apparent that the perpetrator's skill extended beyond brute force or opportunism. The theft bore the hallmarks of calculated design and intimate familiarity, an observation that intensified both our urgency and the sense of danger enveloping the Marlowe household. I must confess that, despite my admiration for Holmes's analytical prowess, I was increasingly consumed by anxiety. Lady Beatrice's fear was contagious, and the sight of her countenance, pale and drawn from apprehension, weighed heavily upon my own spirits. The realization that the household was under siege, not merely in terms of property, but in terms of personal safety, imposed a moral as well as emotional burden upon me. Each sound in the corridors became a cause for heightened alertness, and the servants' nervous glances seemed to confirm the palpable tension that had settled over the estate. I found myself imagining the intruder's movements, contemplating the audacity and skill required to navigate the house unseen, and shuddering at the thought of encountering such a figure in the shadows. Holmes, ever serene and focused, observed my agitation with quiet understanding, occasionally offering terse reassurance. Yet I knew that even he recognized the gravity of the situation, for it was not the fear alone, but the implications of intimate knowledge and ruthless calculation that rendered the household vulnerable. In those moments, I felt the estate's historical grandeur diminished by the threat that had so cunningly penetrated its walls, and I resolved to remain vigilant, both for the safety of Lady Beatrice and for the hope that Holmes's brilliance might yet avert further calamity. While the immediate chaos of the burglary drew our attention to the most conspicuous traces, Holmes's keen eye discerned subtleties that had hitherto escaped notice. Upon inspecting a letter left upon a side table, he noticed a smudge of ink near the corner, scarcely perceptible to anyone less attuned. Its presence suggested hurried handling, perhaps the very moment in which the letter had been surreptitiously removed or replaced. In another instance, he examined the alignment of certain furniture in the drawing room, which had been subtly adjusted in a manner incongruous with the household's customary arrangement. To the casual observer, it seemed a trivial detail, yet Holmes remarked that such displacement might indicate the intruder's habitual route through the room, a path carefully memorized and now betrayed by minor disturbances. He methodically catalogued these observations, explaining to me how even the smallest deviations could betray intent, timing, and familiarity. The ink smudge, combined with the irregularity of furniture placement, constituted a chain of evidence pointing toward an intruder not merely skilled, but precise, patient, and intimately acquainted with the estate's routines. As he spoke, I recorded his words diligently, struck by the contrast between the household's outward panic and the silent, almost reverent attention with which Holmes approached these overlooked clues. Each detail, though seemingly insignificant, was now revealed to be a cornerstone upon which the forthcoming deductions would be constructed, laying the groundwork for the identification of the audacious thief. Later that evening, Holmes and I retired to the study, the room quiet save for the occasional rustle of papers or the ticking of the clock. He seated himself before the hearth, his gaze fixed upon the fire, while his hands traced over the array of notes, letters, and observations we had amassed throughout the day. "Watson," he said in measured tones, "you must attend not only to what has occurred, but to what these events imply. Consider the ink smudge, the alignment of the furniture, and the precise selection of points of entry. These are not mere accidents, but signals deliberately inscribed upon the tableau of the estate." I listened intently, aware that he was offering insight without disclosing the full solution. His language was precise, yet elliptical, hinting at conclusions that would emerge only when all elements were weighed and connected. The subtle interplay between observed behavior, physical traces, and historical context was, in his hands, a narrative to be read by those trained to perceive its significance. Holmes continued, describing how the combination of these overlooked clues would soon converge, allowing us to anticipate the intruder's motives, methods, and perhaps identity. I felt a sense of eager anticipation, coupled with trepidation, for the danger remained tangible and immediate. In that quiet study, amidst scattered papers and the dim glow of the fire, I perceived the first intimations of the reasoning that would unravel the mystery. Holmes's mind, calm yet brilliant, moved along invisible lines of logic, preparing for the revelation that would soon follow, and I, faithful chronicler, could only await the masterful elucidation that lay just beyond the horizon. Holmes summoned the household and ourselves to the drawing room under the pretense of an urgent matter concerning the Bloodstone Map. He began, with his customary calm and deliberate enunciation, to recount a tale that, at first, seemed almost fantastical. He claimed knowledge of a second, concealed map, hidden by an ancestor of the Marlowe family, whose existence had remained secret even to Lady Beatrice herself. The assembled faces betrayed a mixture of astonishment, curiosity, and, in some cases, guarded apprehension. Holmes spoke with deliberate pauses, allowing the weight of his assertions to settle upon his audience, yet every word was measured, carrying the subtle cadence of truth in its presentation. He described how this supposed second map revealed further treasures, offering historical and monetary rewards far surpassing the first, yet warned that such knowledge could only be uncovered by one possessing keen discernment and careful observation. It was clear, even to me, that his tale was a fabrication, a carefully constructed psychological ploy designed to provoke reactions. Holmes's eyes, piercing and observant, scanned the room, noting each flicker of interest, each whispered exchange, and the slightest contraction of a muscle that might betray eagerness or fear. I marveled at his skill, perceiving the ingenuity behind this ruse. By introducing an object of desire that did not exist, he set the stage for a trap that would reveal character, motive, and guilt in a manner far more illuminating than any direct confrontation. The household was drawn into a delicate dance of perception and deception, unaware that they were under the scrutiny of a mind capable of discerning truth from mere pretense with unerring certainty. Thus, the evening's proceedings commenced, and the trap, subtle yet inexorable, began to take form, with Holmes as the conductor of a symphony of observation and deduction. Holmes, ever meticulous, arranged for a gathering at the Marlowe estate under the guise of a social assembly, inviting members of the family, household staff, and several acquaintances whose connection to the estate might be of interest. The planning was executed with precision. Each seat, each line of sight, and every opportunity for discreet observation had been carefully considered. We arrived early, observing Holmes's arrangements with quiet admiration. He instructed Lady Beatrice to maintain her usual composure, assuring her that the gathering was as much a measure of propriety as it was a means of discernment. Subtle placements of refreshments, the positioning of chairs near windows or doors, and the deliberate sequencing of arrivals were all intended to ensure that no movement or expression would escape his attention. As the guests assembled, I could sense the undercurrent of unease mingled with polite cordiality. Holmes moved among them with natural ease, greeting individuals, exchanging small pleasantries, and remarking occasionally on trivial matters. All the while his gaze travelled like a lens, capturing minutiae that would reveal the truth hidden beneath courteous facades. It was remarkable to observe the care with which he controlled the environment, creating a setting in which suspicion, curiosity, and desire would inevitably manifest themselves. I, recording every detail in my journal, realized that the stage had been set not for mere social entertainment, but for the delicate unraveling of a mystery that had long eluded solution. The atmosphere, though outwardly serene, bristled with latent tension, as if the very air anticipated the moment when concealment would yield to revelation. As the gathering progressed, Holmes's attention was unbroken. He observed the subtle expressions upon each face, noting slight contractions of the jaw, the shifting of eyes toward corners of the room, and the barely perceptible tensing of fingers upon arms or laps. These micro-expressions, fleeting yet telling, spoke volumes to him of anxiety, curiosity, or duplicity. I marveled at the ease with which he interpreted these signs, as though each human movement were a sentence in a language of deception and intent. Guests conversed politely, but Holmes's scrutiny transformed ordinary conversation into a theatre of hidden motives. A glance exchanged between two cousins, a faint quiver in the voice of one gentleman when the second map was mentioned, revealed the underlying currents of desire and fear that governed their behaviour. In the corner, a distant Marlowe cousin, hitherto inconspicuous, showed signs of unusual agitation. His eyes flickered toward the hearth when Holmes spoke of the hidden map, and a hand tightened subtly upon a cane he had leaned beside him. Each gesture, each hesitation, was noted and weighed with meticulous care, allowing Holmes to construct a psychological profile in real time. I could scarcely believe the acuity of his observation, for it required not only attention to physical detail, but a deep understanding of human nature. Every guest, knowingly or unknowingly, played a part in the revelation to come, and it became increasingly clear that the culprit's own compulsions were gradually drawing them into the net of Holmes's design. Holmes, having observed the initial reactions, proceeded with his inquiry through a series of casual questions, carefully interwoven into conversation. He asked about family traditions, curiosities of the estate, and anecdotes of past incidents, all topics that appeared innocuous, yet were chosen for their capacity to elicit revealing responses. I watched as the distant cousin shifted uneasily under the weight of seemingly trivial queries. Holmes would remark, for instance, upon a supposed secret passage or the positioning of furniture in a manner that might suggest concealment. Each reference drew a perceptible tension, a brief tightening of the lips, a nervous glance that betrayed familiarity or knowledge beyond the ordinary. Other guests responded with mild interest or polite correction, but it was the subtle departures from normal composure that drew Holmes's attention. A hesitation in speech, a repetition of phrases, or the avoidance of eye contact. All these cues were catalogued silently, woven into the tapestry of deduction. Holmes never pressed with overt confrontation. Instead, he allowed the behavior of the guilty party to reveal itself in miniature, each micro-expression a thread in the larger pattern. It was a masterful orchestration, blending observation with psychological insight, and I could not help but feel a rising awe at the elegance of his method. Through this delicate interplay of question and observation, the truth advanced inexorably, until the contours of the culprit's mind were laid bare, visible to Holmes alone amidst the polite facades of the gathering. At last, Holmes's scrutiny settled upon a single figure with unerring certainty. The distant Marlowe cousin, whose initial demeanour had suggested only polite reserve, revealed through a cascade of micro-signals his preoccupation with the hidden treasure, his anxious regard for the fabricated second map, and, ultimately, his obsessive concern for family honour and wealth. Holmes addressed the assembled company with the calm authority of one presenting an irrefutable truth. "It is apparent," he began, "that one among us is driven not merely by curiosity or casual interest, but by a consuming desire to secure the estate's treasures and to restore perceived slights against the family's honour. The signs, though subtle, were unmistakable in those whose anxiety betrayed knowledge and intent beyond ordinary involvement." The cousin's visage, as Holmes spoke, betrayed a mixture of recognition and apprehension. I noted the flush rising in his cheeks, the involuntary shift of weight, and the tightening of hands upon the arms of his chair. Holmes continued, citing the behavioural cues, the micro-expressions, and the knowledge implied by the subject's reactions. Each piece of evidence, seemingly innocuous, coalesced into an unassailable narrative, pointing solely toward him. The gathering, silent and attentive, seemed to hang upon Holmes' words as if they were the very air itself. In that moment, the psychological trap had achieved its purpose. The culprit, ensnared by his own compulsions and ambitions, could no longer conceal the truth, and Holmes's methodical reasoning illuminated the intricate interplay of motive, opportunity, and human weakness. I remained, throughout, an awed observer, scarcely able to comprehend the precision and subtlety with which Holmes had orchestrated the evening. To manipulate human behaviour without coercion, to allow character and conscience to betray themselves, required not only intellect, but an intimate understanding of the human psyche. As the cousin was discreetly escorted from the room, I reflected upon the near danger from which the household had been delivered. The crisis of the stolen Bloodstone map, the threats and intrusions, might have escalated into greater harm had Holmes not anticipated each reaction, prepared each stage, and directed events with the calm certainty that only he could command. Yet it was not merely the mechanics of deduction that impressed me, but the moral and emotional restraint displayed. He revealed the truth without humbling unnecessarily, exposing deception while preserving the dignity of the innocent, and guiding the guilty into the consequences of their own actions. I, ever faithful chronicler, could only record the brilliance and elegance of his methods, recognizing in that night's proceedings an artistry of intellect rarely witnessed. The household, once anxious and fearful, now exhaled a tentative relief, tempered by the knowledge that danger had only narrowly passed, and that the power of observation, reasoning, and subtle human insight had triumphed where force or alarm might have failed. Holmes led the distant cousin along a narrow, winding path that skirted the edge of the Marlowe estate, away from the watchful eyes of servants and family alike. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds, and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze served as the sole accompaniment to our measured steps. I observed, with some trepidation, the visible tension in the cousin's posture, his head turned frequently, as if anticipating pursuit or betrayal. Holmes' calm presence, by contrast, was unwavering. His gaze, alert and analytical, took in every detail of the surrounding terrain, the slight depressions in the soil, the distant shapes of hedgerows, and the intermittent bird calls that punctuated the otherwise serene landscape. He spoke sparingly, yet each word carried authority, guiding the cousin toward a small clearing secluded from any vantage point the estate might afford. It was in this deliberate isolation that the confrontation would unfold. The quietude of the area contrasted sharply with the storm of anticipation that I felt, as though the very air had grown taut with expectation. Here, removed from the protective confines of the household, the antagonist's demeanour could be observed in its purest form, unshielded by politeness or pretense, and the stage was set for the revelation of truth. The cousin's composure faltered almost immediately upon realizing that the seclusion was not an accidental occurrence, but a deliberate orchestration by Holmes. He attempted, at first, to mask his unease behind a veneer of rational explanation. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice tight yet urgent. "My actions were dictated by a sense of familial duty and a desire to protect our legacy from those who might misuse it." He spoke rapidly, offering a blend of justification and misdirection, each phrase carefully calculated to appeal to Holmes's sense of propriety and logic. He implied that the threats he had issued, and the theft itself, had been conducted with a view toward preserving the estate's treasures, painting himself as a reluctant actor in a moral drama. At times, he introduced veiled warnings, suggesting that discovery could have unforeseen consequences for those who interfered with matters of family honour. Yet beneath the polished words, I discerned the tremor of desperation in his hands and the flicker of fear in his eyes. His obsession was palpable, revealed in the repetitive, almost ritualistic gestures he employed to emphasize his assertions. Holmes, standing with serene attention, allowed him to exhaust himself, observing the contradictions and the unguarded truths that surfaced despite the cousin's careful phrasing. It was a study in psychological tension, a man attempting to wrest control through deceit, yet betrayed at every turn by the compulsions and desires he could not fully suppress. The danger lay not merely in his actions, but in the depth of his obsession, which had driven him to transgress moral boundaries in pursuit of imagined duty. Holmes, with a measured voice that brooked no interruption, began to untangle the web of deception laid before him. "Your claims of duty," he said, "are most persuasive in tone, yet they falter upon the evidence of your own conduct." He gestured to the ground where the intruder's footprints had been recently discovered, and to the ink-stained letter that had been overlooked, each piece serving as a silent, unassailable witness to the truth. Step by step, Holmes addressed each assertion, juxtaposing the cousin's narrative with concrete facts, gleaned from observation and deduction. He noted the inconsistency in the timeline of events, the physical impossibility of certain movements claimed, and the duplicity revealed in the intercepted letters. Each logical point was presented with the calm authority of one who knew the conclusion to be inevitable. Beyond mere evidence, Holmes appealed to the moral dimensions of the cousin's conduct. Obsession, unchecked by conscience, may masquerade as duty, but it remains a perilous companion, he remarked, his eyes never leaving those of the man before him. Your actions have endangered others, manipulated trust, and desecrated the principles you profess to uphold. The cousin, confronted by the incontrovertible synthesis of observation, logic, and moral reasoning, faltered. His attempts at evasion became stammered admissions, and the facade of rational justification crumbled beneath the weight of scrutiny. Holmes's dismantling of each falsehood was as methodical as it was inexorable, leaving no avenue of escape, no refuge in pretense, and no remaining defences of ego or pride. With the cousin thus reduced to reluctant acknowledgement, Holmes produced the genuine Bloodstone Map from its concealment, retrieved through knowledge of the estate's secret recesses and an anticipation of the antagonist's methods. The map, aged yet exquisitely preserved, lay in his hands like a talisman of both historical significance and tangible victory. The cousin, realizing the futility of further resistance, offered no opposition as Holmes formally apprehended him, instructing him to await the arrival of authorities dispatched discreetly by Lady Beatrice. The transition from tension to resolution was swift, executed with the same calm precision that had characterized Holmes's entire approach to the case. I observed the exchange with keen attention. The relief upon Lady Beatrice's face, the measured satisfaction in Holmes's demeanour, and the subdued acknowledgement of guilt upon the cousin's countenance. The artifact, now secure, represented not merely a material victory, but the culmination of reasoning, patience, and insight. A tangible confirmation of the meticulous process through which justice had been achieved. The estate, once shadowed by uncertainty and fear, now breathed a quiet sigh of reprieve. Holmes's method had triumphed where mere force or alarm might have failed, and the delicate equilibrium between intellect and morality was, at least temporarily, restored. Throughout the confrontation, I was acutely aware of the charged interplay of emotion and intellect. The cousin's fear and desperation contrasted sharply with Holmes's serene composure, and in this juxtaposition lay the drama of the encounter. I noted how obsession could distort perception, compelling a man to risk all for perceived duty, and how clear reasoning could gently yet inexorably reveal truth without unnecessary cruelty. Even in the brief silence that followed Holmes's dismantling of the lies, the atmosphere was thick with emotion, relief mingled with shame, tension with reflection. The cousin's eyes, once sharp with calculation, now revealed a flicker of remorse, and Lady Beatrice's gratitude, tempered by lingering unease, spoke to the profound personal stakes that had framed this confrontation. To witness such a resolution, wherein intellect and moral reasoning prevailed, was a privilege, and I recorded every subtle nuance, conscious that the emotional texture of this moment was as significant as the recovery of the artifact itself. As the immediate danger receded, calm returned to the Marlowe estate. The paths once shadowed by uncertainty now seemed open, the corridors freed from the tension of concealed motives. Holmes, standing with his habitual composure, allowed a moment for reflection, ensuring that the household could absorb the events that had transpired. The cousin, escorted away under gentle supervision, had no recourse but acceptance, and the authentic Bloodstone map rested securely where it belonged. Lady Beatrice expressed her gratitude, yet I sensed that the experience had left its mark upon all present, a subtle reminder of the delicate balance between desire, morality, and the prudence demanded by circumstance. Holmes, for his part, spoke little, content that reason, observation, and patience had achieved what force could not. For myself, I chronicled the affair with deep satisfaction, aware that both the intellectual and emotional threads of the case had reached a harmonious conclusion. The audience of readers, I trust, would find equal gratification in the resolution of mystery, danger, and the human passions laid bare. Holmes seated himself with a calm deliberation, drawing the room into an almost sacred stillness. "Dr. Watson," he began, "the solution, as ever, lies in the minutiae of observation, the often overlooked details which, when assembled, create an irrefutable chain." I listened intently as he meticulously recounted the sequence of clues that had gradually led him to the culprit. He spoke first of the initial disturbances at the Marlowe estate, the anonymous letters with their peculiar linguistic flourishes, each one betraying the author's temperament and education. Holmes then addressed the inconsistencies in the movements of household staff, the seemingly trivial dust patterns, and the footprints in the garden, all of which were dismissed by others as inconsequential. He emphasized how the planted false map had been designed to mislead, and yet subtle deviations in ink and paper quality provided silent testimony of its spurious nature. Holmes's articulation was precise and deliberate, each observation linked with logical reasoning that left no room for conjecture. The reader, or, in my own reflection, the listener, could follow the thread from minor peculiarities to the unmasking of a man whose every action, though masked in pretense, bore the signature of his inner compulsions. In recounting these events, Holmes illuminated the power of careful attention and patient deduction, demonstrating that the truth, though obscured by complexity and deception, was always accessible to those who would examine the world with clarity of mind and constancy of purpose. The culmination of these clues, each a single brushstroke, had painted a portrait of guilt that was at once irrefutable and instructive. Holmes leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing with contemplative intensity. The Marlowe cousins' actions, he explained, were governed less by avarice than by a convoluted sense of familial duty and an obsessive fixation on perceived honor. He described how minor slights in childhood, coupled with a lifetime of comparison to more accomplished relatives, had engendered a simmering resentment that erupted into calculated criminality. The cousins' obsession with the Bloodstone Map was a manifestation of deeper psychological needs, a desire for recognition, a compulsion to assert control over a narrative that he imagined belonged solely to him. Holmes noted that the meticulousness of the letters, the deliberate staging of false clues, and the careful monitoring of household routines were not merely tactical, but symptomatic of an obsession that had eroded moral judgment. In emphasizing these motives, Holmes highlighted the frailty of human character when confronted by the dual forces of desire and insecurity. The crime, while outwardly a pursuit of treasure, was inwardly a struggle for identity, validation, and dominion over both legacy and conscience. It was the convergence of these personal flaws with opportunity that rendered the cousins' conduct both dangerous and tragically inevitable. Holmes's tone shifted to one of reverence as he discussed the artifact itself. The Bloodstone Map, he said, is not merely a curiosity of antiquarian interest. It embodies centuries of history, a tangible connection to a lineage of scholars, clerics, and explorers. He described its intricate cartography, the annotations that recorded clandestine passages, and the subtle symbolism embedded within its design. The map's appeal was thus twofold: historical and symbolic. Its provenance and the knowledge it encoded made it an object of intellectual fascination, while its association with the Marlowe lineage conferred upon it an aura of prestige and moral weight. Holmes elucidated how these factors combined to motivate those who would pursue it with single-minded intensity, for possession of the map signified both material advantage and the satisfaction of a deeper, almost spiritual ambition. He further explained that understanding the map's significance was essential to interpreting the actions of the culprit. The lengths to which the Marlowe cousin had gone, the forgeries, the surveillance, the stage gatherings, were all rendered intelligible when one appreciated the map's value in historical, symbolic, and familial terms. In Holmes's exposition, the artifact itself became a lens through which the motives, obsessions, and moral failings of men could be clearly discerned. Holmes smiled faintly, the hint of amusement in his eyes belying the gravity of the events. "No investigation is complete without misdirection," he observed. In this case, we encountered a series of deliberate deceptions, forged maps, misleading notes, and staged observations, each designed to lead pursuers astray. He described how these false leads, though intricate and convincing, bore subtle inconsistencies detectable only by the attentive mind. The planted copy of the Bloodstone Map, for instance, differed in minutiae of ink composition and alignment. The letters, though threatening, revealed linguistic patterns inconsistent with the true perpetrator. Holmes demonstrated that, by tracing these discrepancies and cross-referencing them with physical evidence, the path to the genuine culprit became clear. The lesson, he suggested, was one of patience and scrutiny. Where the unobservant are confounded by artifice, the disciplined intellect discerns the underlying truth. Every deception, however cunning, left a trace that could be followed by those alert to the smallest of signals. As Holmes concluded his exposition, I reflected upon the sequence of events with a mixture of awe and admiration. The intricacy of the case, its red herrings, subtle clues, and the delicate interplay of psychology and circumstance, was laid bare before us, allowing the mind to trace each deduction in sequence. It became apparent that the resolution had required more than mere observation. It demanded empathy, patience, and moral discernment. To follow Holmes's reasoning was to witness the convergence of intellect and character, the capacity to weigh not only facts, but the human motives that animated them. In narrating this, I hoped that the audience could appreciate the meticulousness of Holmes's method, the ethical dimension of his pursuit, and the beauty inherent in a mystery resolved through intelligence rather than chance. The case of the Bloodstone Map was thus closed, yet the lessons it imparted of vigilance, discernment, and the fragile boundaries of human desire lingered long after the final deduction had been made. Holmes sat by the fire, his gaze fixed upon the flickering flames. Yet his mind seemed to traverse realms far beyond the comfortable warmth of the room. "Dr. Watson," he began, his voice measured and deliberate, "the most remarkable truths of human nature are often revealed in the quietest of actions, in those minute obsessions which escape the notice of the casual observer." I listened with rapt attention as he spoke of the Marlowe case. The manner in which a single-minded fixation upon the Bloodstone Map had dominated the thoughts and deeds of the cousin, shaping his every choice with the inevitability of a relentless tide. Holmes reflected on secrecy as a companion to obsession, noting how individuals of otherwise sound judgment may construct intricate veils of concealment around desires they deem shameful or unattainable. "Secrecy," he continued, "is seldom a matter of cunning alone. It is the outward manifestation of an inward compulsion, and it is often obsession that compels men to risk all for what they believe to be their rightful due." He spoke of ambition likewise, a force capable of inspiring great achievement, yet equally potent in its capacity to blind and distort moral sensibilities. As he traced the delicate threads connecting desire, secrecy, and obsession, I realized that the lessons of this case were not confined to the walls of the Marlowe estate. They extended to the broader human condition, revealing that even the most orderly of societies is shaped in part by impulses that, if unbridled, can yield consequences both subtle and catastrophic. Holmes's meditation was sober, yet penetrating, leaving in my mind a profound impression of the delicate interplay between human aspiration and the shadows it casts. Holmes's eyes, normally so incisive and serene, seemed to glint with the caution of one contemplating unseen dangers. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how a mind, perfectly rational in ordinary pursuits, may traverse the narrow boundary that separates lawful ambition from criminality." He elaborated upon the cousin's conduct, noting that the theft, the threats, and the intricate manipulations were not acts of unreason, but rather the culmination of desires unchecked by conscience. "The line," Holmes explained, "is fragile because it is not drawn upon paper, but exists within the moral fabric of each individual. A man may convince himself that his schemes are justified, that his ambition warrants extraordinary measures, until he finds that he has stepped, almost imperceptibly, into realms forbidden by law and propriety." In the Marlowe case, the descent was gradual yet inexorable, fueled by obsession, fear of shame, and the seductive power of perceived destiny. Holmes's reflections carried an implicit warning. Vigilance over one's own desires is necessary, for in their distortion lies the genesis of wrongdoing. It is this delicate balance between intent and action, he concluded, which determines whether a man remains within the bounds of morality or succumbs to the compelling forces of crime. As the household slowly regained its accustomed rhythms, I observed Lady Beatrice in moments of fragile repose, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped the recovered Bloodstone map. The ordeal had left its mark upon her countenance. Relief was tempered by the lingering shadow of fear. Yet in conversation she spoke with renewed dignity of her family's heritage and the importance of preserving its memory, as though the trial had deepened her appreciation for both life and history. The staff, too, exhibited subtle signs of recovery. Whispers of caution were replaced by quiet laughter in the kitchens. Watchful eyes now relaxed into ordinary attentiveness. The servant who had been found unconscious displayed renewed vitality, though one could not fail to detect the lingering apprehension in the line of his shoulders and the carefulness of his movements. I, for my part, felt the weight of the household's collective anxiety ease only gradually. The resolution of the case had brought satisfaction, yet the echo of tension remained, a testament to the intensity of the events we had witnessed. In reflecting upon these emotions, I was reminded that the conclusions of logic and justice must always coexist with the slow, careful restoration of the human spirit, and that in understanding both, one grasps the full measure of a case's significance. The Marlowe estate had endured, yet its members bore a silent testament to the fragility of security and the enduring potency of human fear. Even as calm settled over the estate, Holmes's expression bore the faintest trace of pensiveness. "Do not assume, Watson, that all those who covet the Bloodstone map are now satisfied," he remarked. His words, deliberate and measured, suggested that the conclusion of our immediate investigation was but a partial closure. He speculated upon the existence of distant observers, those who might have tracked our progress from afar or awaited the moment when caution faltered. While the Marlowe cousin had been apprehended, the allure of the map remained potent. In the minds of certain individuals, the value of the artifact transcended both law and conscience. Holmes's insight revealed that human ambition and greed are rarely extinguished by a single confrontation. I could not help but notice, in the subtle glances of the household staff and the quiet vigilance of Lady Beatrice, that an unspoken acknowledgement persisted, that the world beyond the estate walls held shadows yet unexamined. Holmes's remark, though veiled, imparted a sense of unease, a reminder that in every solved mystery lies the seed of another. Waiting patiently in silence, challenging the prudent and alert to remain vigilant. As I pen these final reflections, I am struck by the enduring lessons of the Bloodstone map affair. We have observed the delicate interplay of ambition, obsession, and morality, and witnessed how the human heart, when guided by desire untempered by conscience, may tread perilously close to wrongdoing. Holmes's deductions have illuminated not only the external acts of crime, but the internal struggles that drive them, revealing the fragile architecture of character beneath the surface of ordinary life. For the reader or listener, there remains the opportunity to ponder. In our own pursuits, how often do ambition and desire brush against moral boundaries? And what lessons might we draw from the missteps of others? As history and human nature intertwine, the allure of mystery endures, challenging us to observe, to reflect, and to question. In that spirit, I invite you to consider both the perils and the marvels inherent in human aspiration, and to remember that vigilance of mind and heart is ever the surest guide through the labyrinth of life. As we stood by the grand hearth of the Marlowe estate, Holmes's eyes seemed to pierce the very shadows lingering in the corners. "It is remarkable, Watson," he said quietly, "how the smallest hint of ambition, mingled with secrecy and a touch of vanity, can so swiftly tip a mind from noble purpose into folly. The map was but a lure, yet the obsession it inspired revealed far more about the heart of the seeker than any document ever could. One learns at last that the true peril lies not in the treasure itself, but in the shadows cast by human desire. I nodded, still absorbing the tension of the past days. And yet, I murmured, even the cleverest schemes cannot escape the scrutiny of reason. Holmes gave a faint smile. Precisely, my dear friend. And it is in those unnoticed details, those quiet patterns, that justice waits to assert itself. But consider this, Watson. The case is closed, yet human nature remains as unpredictable as ever. What do you think was the criminal's gravest miscalculation? The moment that allowed reason to prevail? Could the obsession have led him astray in ways even he did not foresee? Share your thoughts and theories below. Your insight may reveal details that even I have overlooked. If you have enjoyed this journey into the fog and intrigue of the Marlowe estate, do comment with your answer, subscribe to follow our next adventure, and share this tale with friends who delight in the mysteries of London's hidden streets. The game of deduction never truly ends, and there are always more secrets awaiting the observant eye.